Okay.
Yang Berhormat Datuk Sri Saifuddin Abdullah, Minister of Foreign Affairs Malaysia, Dr. Juwita Muhammad, Director of Research Ideas Malaysia, Your Excellencies, distinguished speakers, distinguished guests, ladies, gentlemen, and youth. Very good morning and selamat pagi. My name is Jazrin Harith and I'll be your moderator for today. Please allow me to begin with a short housekeeping announcement. At Ideas, we are committed to provide a safe environment for all parties, both internal and external, to work together. Ideas has a policy of zero tolerance towards sexual exploitation and abuse. Everyone here today is responsible for making this event a safe space for public discourse. Please be reminded that this event is recorded and please mute your microphone during today's proceeding. During the Q&A session later, you can submit your questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ideas webinar, Youth Perspective on the ASEAN Economic Community. What does it mean for the local youth in ASEAN member states? To begin today's proceeding, may I have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Juwita Muhammad, Director of Research Ideas Malaysia, to deliver her welcoming remarks. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you, Jazrin. Good morning and selamat pagi. I would like to warmly welcome our honored guest, Datuk Sri Saifuddin bin Abdullah, our Minister of Foreign Affairs of Malaysia, our distinguished speakers, our esteemed partners, ladies and gentlemen. I am Juwita Muhammad, and I'm so excited to be a part of this webinar titled Youth Perspective on the ASEAN Economic Community. What does it mean for local youth in AMS? Just a bit of a background to this webinar. This webinar is only one of the many deliverables of the ASEAN Prosperity Initiative project that we're embarking on. For your information, the API, or the ASEAN Prosperity Initiative, is a research advocacy-based project which seeks to examine or to highlight the key opportunities as well as challenges faced by the ASEAN economy for the period up to 2025. So the API is again one of the flagship projects of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs Ideas, and is intended to serve as a focal reference point for development and also economic related issues on the Southeast Asian region. So again, the project is jointly funded by the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Democracy. So this year is the last year of the 3-year project, and we aim to end it with a big bang. So apart from this webinar, we will have another one in September, examining the stumbling blocks faced by ASEAN member states to the road of integration. So this year alone, we have produced podcasts on topics like mega free trade agreements in ASEAN, strengthening competition laws, creating a level playing field, narrowing human capital development gaps in ASEAN, as well as a podcast specifically looking at the ASEAN global value chains and its disruptions. So these contents are then translated into different infographics, which can be accessed on our API website. We are also very ambitious this year as we are scanning through all of the 5 pillars for progress of the AEC 2025 blueprint. So you have pillar 1 on highly integrated and cohesive economy, pillar 2, which is more on competition, innovation, and also a dynamic ASEAN. Pillar 3 is mostly focused on enhancing connectivity as well as sectoral cooperation. Pillar 4 will be on resilient and inclusive people-oriented region. And the last pillar would be a global ASEAN, where we fit in as Malaysia is a small open economy. So again, our write-up will touch upon the key issues, including food security, GVC disruptions, issues on narrowing the gaps between the CLMV and non-CLMV countries, issues on productivity, cybersecurity, e-commerce, among others. Our researchers are working together with experts from ASEAN and beyond to contribute to this report, which will be launched at the end of the year. So more information will be trickling through in the next couple of weeks and months. And we're so excited to be working on a regional-wide focus, as Malaysia is again a very small but open economy. ASEAN and other trading partners in the region play an important role in contributing to the growth of our economy and also our labor force. So we hope that Malaysia, as part of ASEAN, can continue to make progress in its commitments, not just on trade-related issues, but also on areas such as social and also on inclusivity. And this is just one of the focus point that we saw as a key focal point, which is on youth empowerment and youth issues. So without further ado, I will pass again the floor to our moderator, Jazrin, who will then welcome our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Juwita, for your welcoming remarks. Now, it is my honor to invite Yang Berhormat Datuk Sri Saifuddin Abdullah to deliver his keynote address. The floor is yours, Datuk.
Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera. Saudara pengerusi Dr. Juwita dan teman-teman, pertamanya saya ucapkan tahniah kepada Ideas kerana menganjurkan webinar pada hari ini dan terima kasih kerana mengikut sertakan saya bersama-sama. My dear brothers and sisters, if I may very briefly touch on 3 major points in my short intervention. Number 1, there are issues that ASEAN as a community is still facing when it comes to this concept called the ASEAN Economic Community. It is of course part of the bigger concept, the ASEAN community, which have 3 pillars: the political and security pillar, the economic pillar, and the social or socio-cultural pillar. Now, among the issues that we are faced is the fact that the idea about the ASEAN Economic Community as compared to how the EU progressed, and I have to underline that I'm not trying to compare apple to orange. We know the difference, but I'm just talking about the background of it. The EU started a long time ago, and it is an evolution. It was started as an economic cooperation grouping, whereas ASEAN started as a political security grouping. But that's history. But there's something else behind it. It was conceptualized. It went through serious years of engagement and discussion. Almost everyone, all stakeholders were there and involved. And the public was also involved in the sense that there were surveys and there were it was a very conscious effort to get feedback inputs from the public. The AEC was not developed that way. It was conceptualized, drafted in a very short period of time, and it was elitist in the way it was drafted and formulated by policymakers and diplomats. Many of the people, including stakeholders, were not involved in the drafting, in the conceptualizing of the AEC. The other issue is the intra-ASEAN trade is still low. I think we need to do a lot of work when it comes to intra-ASEAN trade. The third issue will be the disparity between the 10 ASEAN member states is still notable. Some people look at ASEAN and divide it into two. The way we look at things sometimes, for practical reason, even in my office, we have ASEAN desk, we have CMLV desk. So subconsciously, we are dividing ASEAN into two groupings. The other issue is connectivity, both land connectivity and telecommunication in terms of connectivity. When it comes to telecommunication, there is still limitation in terms of mastery and creativity in terms of the technology. Yeah. The other issue is poverty. And finally, because of the pandemic, some of these issues become more intense and become more problematic. We have a higher rate of unemployment among the young. Business is not doing very well. People are just coming back to start to open up their businesses. Government funding is low because government has spent most of their pocket on handouts and welfare programs because of the pandemic. Now, the second point that I want to raise is even deeper than the first one. And this I'm referring to the ASEAN architecture or the ASEAN culture or the ASEAN way of life or way of doing things. And I just want to touch on two items. One is on democracy. I understand if you want to do business, you don't have to do business always with a democratic government or in a democratic ecosystem. You can do business with dictators and things like that. But I think we still have to work on democratization in ASEAN because it has a lot of, it will open windows, if I can say it that way, to businesses and to the young. Dr. Juwita mentioned about youth empowerment. Youth empowerment is a democratic issue. There's no empowerment within a non-democratic ecosystem. And we all understand that there are many definitions of empowerment in some countries. Empowerment simply means I put some young people there for show as a tokenism, and hence I say, hey, I'm so pro-young people and I empower young, but it's all rubbish. We know that. We are talking about real empowerment. I'm happy we have a researcher from Majlis Belia Malaysia here. This is her forte. I won't go back and try to become to pretend I'm still young. Yeah. The second point is the openness to trade and technology, which is related to economy. There are two sides of the coin, if I may. One is the actual trade and technology. We all know that if a country is not open enough to foreign trade and to embrace technology and to invite technology, I mean, the story of Silicon Valley will explain that openness is so that very important when it comes to the development, the creation especially and innovation of technology. I won't go into the detail. But the second side of the coin is this. Southeast Asia, our region, is like, every superpowers wants to have a say in our region. So there is this competition. We need to be resilient and united in telling all these superpowers that, yes, by all means, come and compete in our region, but only on two T's, trade and technology, not the other T, threats of military and political might. I'm trying to introduce this language at the foreign ministers' meetings because sometimes ASEAN are so timid in talking to the superpowers, simply saying, we remain a zone of peace, a region of peace, neutral. Yeah. Yeah, the ZOFAN thing. Yeah, it is valid, yes, but sometimes we need to be clearer in our language, in telling people, by all means, come here, do business, do this, but no, we don't need the other things. Now, that brings me to the third point, the way forward, and in particular for the young. Let me just touch one area, the SMEs. And this is really an assumption that most young people probably, when they enter into business, then the starting point would be SME. But the second reason why I'm using SME is because we all know the SME is the backbone of most of ASEAN member states. But there was this research done by ISIAS, Yusof Ishak Institute. This could be Dr. Eric's colleague, Cassie Lee, Dionysius Najoko, and Sotia Ong. I'm sure you know them. And they were looking at SMEs and economic integration in Southeast Asia. And the conclusion of the finding is quite interesting. And I will just read one whole paragraph from their findings. Overall, there is still a low level of awareness of AEC among SMEs, especially in some of the less developed ASEAN member countries. Just now I talked about the disparity. In these countries, there is significant uncertainty among SMEs about how the AEC will impact their business. Now, an important facilitator of SME internationalization is FTA, the free trade agreements. The relatively low utilization rate of FTAs among SMEs, especially in the less developed Southeast Asian countries, indicates that the barriers to using FTAs remain real and substantial. Government support for SME development, including those aimed at encouraging SMEs to export, remain uneven across ASEAN member states. So I'm just throwing that issue perhaps for discussion. Now, the second point on the way forward, so the way forward is really looking at how can we improve and strengthen the role of the SMEs, not within the AMS, but in the region as a whole. Second is we need to be to bring all stakeholders together in policy making when it comes to youth in economy or the economy or everything that we do. And this has got something to do with my earlier point on the way we do things in ASEAN. Generally speaking, there are the three major players or key stakeholders in any nation building initiative. There is the state, the business, and the civil society, and youth is part of the civil society. I think we need to strengthen this engagement, consultation as partners in development among the three. My third point on the way forward is really to put a lot of emphasis on digital economy. And here again, we are talking about technology. Technology is inevitable, but the young people are the real drivers of technology. We really have to make this real, because I sense sometimes some of our ASEAN member states, as much as they say digital economy is really championed by the young, but somehow there is this, either it's cultural or political, but somehow I don't think we are all on the same page when we say, let the young people unleash their true potentials, and hence we are not really reaping the best of benefits from digital economy in a certain way. We can have the best of blueprint. Malaysia have My Digital. Almost every ASEAN member state has their own blueprint, but I have yet to see that as a whole in ASEAN, we really bring digital economy to a certain level. Indonesia is blessed because the current Minister of Education was the founder of Gojek. So he understands technology. I'm very happy. I had a good conversation with him, and I said, wow, if only all ministers of education, in ASEAN, things like him, then wow, okay. My next point is, now, you need to support digital economy with an ecosystem that is different than the old economy. I just give you one example, work culture. A digital economy driven economy is an economy of part-timers and professional freelancers. Government must realize that gone are the days when majority of employees are full-timers and they are loyal to the organization. This is gone. I have a daughter who's 29. She jumped from one place to another, and I was at one time having a headache with my wife. What is our daughter doing? She's doing fine. She leaves one company and go to another, and we call it job hopping. No, for them it's adventure. It's new opportunities, different worldview, different perspective altogether. I'm 61, she's 29. I don't understand her. Yeah, but I have to give it to her. She knows what she's doing. Her generation knows what they are doing. So we can't think about job and work like when we were young. It's a totally different world. As I said, gone are the days of the full-timers. We have to embrace, this is the era of freelance professionals and part-timers. And because of that, we have to change the way we look at salary slip. They still need salary slip because they need to make loans from the bank. Banks have to change the way they offer loans. You can't ask a 3-month salary slip. This guy just started his or her own business. No 3-month salary slip. Is salary slip still relevant? That's another question. Yeah. So new salary scheme, new salary slips, new ways of giving bank loans and car loan and housing loan. So, but if the ecosystem doesn't change, if my daughter will say, "Ayah, I can't live in this world." I mean, I do things freelance, and everyone, when I go to the bank, they say, I want something permanent. No, we have to change the way we do things. What is our strength in ASEAN? Our strength in ASEAN is our own population. It's a huge market of more than 500 million. And my last submission will be, even if you can't achieve the kind of the AEC or the ASEAN community that we dreamed of when we wrote about it in 2015, at least I think the young has the opportunity to turn it into a digital community. So even if it is not a physical face-to-face community, it is a digital community. Now, in conclusion, I would like to say that we need to do two things. Number one, yes, we have to work on the way forward. How do we encourage, motivate, enable, empower the young to play a greater role in the AEC, and how can we move the AEC in a bigger way. We want to see its success. Of course, we are all committed to it, but at the same time, we must realize that the AEC does not operate in a vacuum. It moves in a bigger ecosystem, in a bigger framework, in a bigger architecture, which also needs to be reformed in some ways. Probably not our topic for the day, but we just have to remember that we need to do this, and we have to be supportive of the others. So we can have our webinar on AEC today. We also have to take cognizance that there are also equally important webinars on human rights, on democratization, and we should connect with all of those people who are doing good works when it comes to realizing the ASEAN community as a whole. So thank you, and I'll try to be here for as long as possible, but Parliament has a very interesting topic discussed today, so as and when necessary, I really have to leave. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Yang Berhormat, for the keynote address and for outlining the key issues faced not just by youth, but as ASEAN as a whole. So it has been a pleasure having you here and to set the tone for the panel discussion. To proceed with our panel discussion, I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists joining us today. First, we have Dr. Eric Thompson. He's a principal investigator from ASEAN Youth Development Index Survey from the National University of Singapore. Next, we have Associate Professor Dr. Niza Yaakob, lecturer of Faculty of Social Science and Humanities from the University Malaysia Sarawak, UNIMAS, Malaysia. And lastly, we have Dr. Shafiqa Abdul Rahim. She's a researcher from the Malaysia Youth Council, MBM Malaysia. And I am Jazrin, your moderator for today. Before we start our panel discussion in detail, allow me to explain our topic for today. So as mentioned by Dr. Juwita, through the Ideas ASEAN Prosperity Initiative Project 2022, funded by the Frederick Naumann Foundation for Freedom, FNF, this webinar aims to facilitate a conversation with youth representatives and experts to understand their views on the ASEAN Economic Community and its challenges in the next few years to come. Asking the question of, what does it mean for local youth in ASEAN member states? Our webinar viewers from across ASEAN member states will get to hear the opinions of our distinguished panelists from ASEAN member states and experts ranging from youth leaders and academic experts. So, the challenges were exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, as young workers in ASEAN have been particularly hard hit as youth employment losses were at 6.2% as opposed to 2.8% for adults, driving youth into either unemployment or inactivity. This is also reflected in the increased share of youth not in employment, education, or training, and EET between 2019 and 2020 in large parts of the ASEAN region. On top of worsened vulnerability, the COVID-19 crisis added complications of disrupted education and training pathways due to movement restrictions and school closures. The quality of education, for instance, was impacted by school closures, which directly affected more than 152 million students in Southeast Asia alone since 2020. There was also disparity in access to education due to the differences in digital transformation among ASEAN member states. This calls for us to understand the challenges and opportunities that are faced and available to youth in ASEAN. This webinar is important because it revolves around the discourse on the implementation of the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint 2025, or the AEC, and the realization of deeper economic partnerships between ASEAN member states they are fraught with political and practical challenges. It is in that light that this webinar plans to provide a platform for achieving an integrated, flourishing ASEAN economy whilst engaging regional experts in an intellectual setting. And as future leaders of ASEAN, youth participation is important in shaping the future integration of the AEC, which the panel discussion hopes to contribute. Now, without further ado, let's hear from our first invited panel, Dr. Eric. What does the AEC mean for youth in ASEAN? Over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. It's a wonderful opportunity to discuss this topic and to participate with this very excellent, distinguished set of panelists. I'm going to begin. I will just maybe to help give a framework for our discussions in terms of how this panel was framed in reference to the ASEAN Youth Development Index. Let me give just a brief overview of what that is and how it relates to the AEC. So the Youth Development Index, it's basically a project and undertaking that's been developed by ASEAN, the ASEAN Secretariat, over at least the last 5, maybe more like 7 years. And in fact, the Youth Development Index was, the development of the index was done in 2 phases. So phase 1 covered 4 areas. Those were employment and opportunities, health and well-being, education, and then participation, like civic participation. So those were originally sort of analyzed and a framework was developed for tracking those in an index. The idea of the index is basically to try to track how sort of the opportunities and the situation essentially for youth across the region, across all 10 ASEAN member states, so that over time there can be sort of tracking whether or not there's progress in these sorts of areas like health and well-being, like education and so forth, right? But from the beginning, there was a 5th domain that was conceptualized to go along with those other 4, which was on awareness, values, and identity. So awareness of ASEAN, sort of ASEAN values and how much the youth across the region felt attached to those values, and then also a sort of sense of ASEAN identity. How do youth feel that they relate to ASEAN as a organization, but more importantly as a kind of community, right? A Southeast Asian community. And so what happened though was in the development of this, there was actually a first group that I was not involved with. There was a first group who did that phase 1 and did the first 4 domains. But when it came to the 5th domain, they felt like this is not something that there was readily available data for. So it wasn't something like employment or education. You can go to any sort of national government and national archives and so forth, and various government bodies, right, will be tracking those kinds of things. But awareness and values and identity, these are somewhat more ambiguous concepts and things that aren't quite tracked. Now, but I had been doing, I should also mention my colleague, Chulani Tiantai, who's a researcher from Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. And then also another partner was Apachai Sunchinda, who's actually had he's more of a diplomat, but he was a formerly the executive director of the ASEAN Foundation. So they were partners on this project as well. So previously, when Kun Apachai was the executive director of the ASEAN Foundation, Chilani and I had done a project or a couple of projects for them, looking at these kinds of topics of awareness and identity and perceptions and orientations towards ASEAN. So we were actually tasked with or brought on board by the ASEAN Secretariat to develop a survey to try to track these things. And so I won't go into all the details of the findings and so forth, and there is a report that you can look at. But just to say that generally what we were looking at was kind of the understanding. So trying to see what what the understandings of what ASEAN is among young people and sort of their relationship to ASEAN. One might say in very general terms, how do people feel about, in a sense, being citizens of ASEAN, right? In addition to, not in contrast to, but in addition to sort of national identity and national citizenship, there's a sort of larger concept of being not only a part of, obviously still a part of one's nation and a national citizen, but also being kind of a citizen of the region as well, right? In the same way that people talk about things like being a citizen of the world, right? That our community these days, because we're so interconnected, is not just our local community, it's not just our family, and even it's not just our own nation, but it's really, we're also members of a kind of world community. But in the case of ASEAN, there's a sense of like this, something between kind of a world citizen and a national citizen, being a sort of citizen of the region. And then to reiterate something, again, it was mentioned before by our keynote speaker, Dato Sri Saifuddin. The ASEAN really has three ASEAN has three pillars, right? There's a security pillar, an economic pillar, and a sociocultural cultural pillar. Now, from its very beginnings, if you look at the Bangkok Declaration, which first began ASEAN, all of these three pillars, all of these three concerns are in the ASEAN concept from the very beginning. But I would say up until the 1990s, and with the integration of all the current 10 members into ASEAN, really the security and kind of diplomatic framework took precedence. But since the early 2000s in particular, even starting around 1997, 1998, there's been much and much more attention to the economic and also the social and cultural pillars, right? And so, of course, the AEC, the ASEAN Economic Community, is really trying to formalize a framework for economic cooperation and integration with ASEAN. But I think it's important for us to also think of this, and this is, I think, echoing again some of the very important concerns brought up by our keynote speaker, that the ASEAN, that the AEC and the economic pillar has to also be thought about in relationship to the social and cultural pillar, right? ASEAN, not just as an economic community and not just as a security community, but also as a social and cultural community. That is, how can different members of different nations in ASEAN cooperate in social and cultural terms? And this goes to things like the things that were mentioned about democratization, about the importance of having a place in promoting small and medium enterprises. And I think very importantly, as this framework that is being promoted here of the ASEAN Prosperity Initiative, I think that thinking about the ways that ASEAN cooperation can really bring prosperity to the region, and not only prosperity, but very importantly, not only prosperity to sort of the most well-off or the largest corporations and so forth, but how do we have broad, wide prosperity across the region and across citizens of all of the nations of ASEAN? And I think so, and I think that in that sense, part of what this requires is a sense of being members of a community, right? That being not only beholden to, say, one's own nation, but having a concern about the community of ASEAN more broadly. And so that, and then finally, I'll just say as a final point that when we thought, so one of the concerns is about thinking about what does it mean to have an ASEAN identity, right? To identify with the region. And one of the things that we developed was the concept of a values-oriented identity. Now, I think I don't want to take too much time here, so I think I'll leave it at that, but I can bring that up later in my further remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eric, for sharing the overview of the ASEAN Youth Development Index. And Dr. Eric has also highlighted the key findings, which includes like youth awareness on values and identity of ASEAN, which brings us to our next guest panelist, Dr. Niza, who is an educator himself, who has supervised both research and led research in topics such as Borneo students' perspective on the values of ASEAN. So, Dr. Niza, as an educator, how does youth or students in particular view the ASEAN Economic Community? The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Jazran. Honorable Minister Dato' Sri Saifuddin Abdullah, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum and good morning. So the focus for me today is to look at the university student perspective toward ASEAN Economic Community, and at the same time how to encourage interest among these youth, to participate in ASEAN study. Now, let me go to the first topic. Now, education, as you all know, is the backbone of the society, and university is the source of strength. While university students often regarded to be leaders of tomorrow. Now, the emphasis on the knowledge-based economy in the era of IR 4.0, we can see the proportion of young people who receive education, university education, has increased tremendously in the ASEAN countries. And these university students, as I mentioned, they are the future leaders. They are also the generation that will continue the mission of ensuring the success of ASEAN integration to the concept of ASEAN Economic Community. So the youth and the university students' perspective toward ASEAN Economic Community need to be carefully explored, and considered. Now, from our study and our survey of 600 university students in Borneo, from University Malaysia Sarawak, University Brunei Darussalam, University Tanjung Pura, in West Kalimantan, Indonesia, we found out that 70% of these university students have know about the existence of ASEAN Economic Community. So that's the positive side. As you know, ASEAN Economic Community, its aim is to achieve a single integrated market to the process of regional economic integration. But when we ask further on the issues of whether they are ready to compete with other graduates, on the issue of whether they are willing to share the wealth of the nation with other countries, on the issues of whether they are optimistic about the success of ASEAN Economic Community, it gives a different picture. For example, when we ask them, these university students, whether they are ready to compete with other students from ASEAN countries to get jobs or employment, only 66% from Indonesia, 41% from Malaysia, and 35% from Brunei said yes. So it's not really encouraging in that way. What more? I believe the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the graduate unemployment would reduce this figure even further if the study is carried out now. For example, like Malaysia currently, we have about 200,000, more than 200,000 unemployed graduates. Yesterday, even the Ministry of Higher Education, in its you can say at the Parliament session, mentioned about during COVID-19 2020 to 2021, about 30,000 public university students failed to complete their study. So can you imagine if the competition is allowed? So we can see you can see the view of the university student now. If they are asked to compete with other students, definitely it will be not positive at all. Now we ask further with the student whether how about sharing the economic development. The reason is that we want to gauge whether they are willing to share their country economic advantage with other people in the region. This is similar with the Prosper Your Neighbor policy that Malaysia have. And we found out that only 51% Indonesian students, 43% Malaysian said yes. However, majority of Brunei University students answered no. This indicates to some extent that they still find the idea of sharing economic development is something that they are not ready yet. Yeah. Number 3, when we ask further if the university students are optimistic about the success of ASEAN Economic Community, 61% from Indonesia, 39% from Malaysia, 35% from Brunei said yes. So it's not that encouraging. Yeah. So even though majority of these university students in Borneo in particular have heard about ASEAN Economic Community, yeah, but in general notion, it seems that they are pessimistic toward the success of the establishment. Basically, we can see this is due largely to the lack of information and understanding among the university students, particularly on the purpose of the integration itself. Hence, I guess what is pertinent now, one is with regard to the issue of the promotion. Yeah, promoting ASEAN Economic Community basically is a collective responsibility among ASEAN government. Yeah, in ensuring the success. In the context of Malaysia, I guess the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Tourism and Culture, International Trade, they are the main agencies that are supposed to promote AEC and to promote greater awareness and understanding of ASEAN community among Malaysian youth. And these agencies also need to embark and be more aggressive, in my opinion, yeah, to foster what we call collective ASEAN community spirits, yeah, in Malaysia through online media, of course, with the youth. Secondly, I just touched a little bit, before I pass to the moderator, encouraging interest among youth to participate in ASEAN studies. I guess this involved with the universities, in the context of universities, courses should be introduced on ASEAN at not only universities, maybe at schools also, yeah, about ASEAN community as a whole. And ASEAN universities should be encouraged to establish ASEAN studies, yeah. Even though this ASEAN studies is comparatively new in comparison to the Southeast Asian studies, yeah, but this is more on the contemporary issues and more on the transnational impact, which is to some extent interest more toward by the youth, interest to the youth. I think I'll stop there, Mr. Jason.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Niza. Thank you for sharing your findings on Borneo students' perspective. It is interesting to see that 70% of Borneo students, Brunei included, have a awareness on ASEAN, but it is also quite worrying that majority of students left school or drop out of school, and which this webinar aims to further understand, like youth can be further empowered through education. And now we have our next panelist, Dr. Shafiqa, who's advocating for youth empowerment through education. So, Dr. Shafiqa, as a youth activist and a researcher yourself, what does it mean for you to be a youth in ASEAN? Over to you.
Thank you, Jazreen, for the question. Thank you, IDIS as well, for inviting me in this panel. And yeah, to answer Jazreen's question just now, how does it feel to be youth in ASEAN? I feel that if I am still considered young, of course, I feel that it is empowering to know that I will have connections through the all 10 countries in ASEAN. And that alone provides stability in terms of, like Dr. Eric mentioned just now, the sense of identity of ASEAN itself for young people. Yeah, and in answering your question as well, I would like to also share a slide, if you don't mind.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you. So I would like to introduce that we have, well, in focusing on the role of youth organizations in ASEAN as well, I think it is important to highlight the youth collective action in this. So in responding as well to what Dr. Eric mentioned just now about the identity, about the sense of belonging of ASEAN, it is important for us and policymakers, senior officials, ASEAN leaders to encourage the youth participation, encourage youth engagement and consultation, just like being mentioned by Yang Muhammad Datuk Sri Saifuddin just now, and also highlighted what Dr. Nizar mentioned just now as well. So the role of youth organization in ASEAN is very important. We can see from the dialogues that were recently held by ASEAN Secretariat, the first dialogue where they invited young people across ASEAN to share what they already did in pandemic. And then it was amazing to see that young people raised up in pandemic and finding ways to innovative ways even to help and to find solutions for their community. So for example, in Indonesia, there are students that call themselves as the study friends. So they created a safe space for students themselves for peer-to-peer learning and create that space for young people to learn together because they found themselves demotivated and they found that schools are very competitive in that terms. So they innovate ways and solutions to collaborate with each other. And I found it really motivating as well to know that young people across ASEAN are doing that. And there are students from the Philippines and Thailand that are doing things such as environmental consciousness raising. And it was interesting to see because even young people in Thailand, we know Thailand, right? The people are very creative and innovative. When they declared that there are no use plastic bag, they use whatever material that is available for them to shop, to bring items to go to shop, right? And then to put in items in trolleys and such things. And I think it is amazing to see that those are the kinds of innovations that we wanted to see. And those started within individual youth. And then it comes to collective action as well, because people starting to realize, well, we can do it differently, just like Datuk mentioned just now, long gone to days on how we see things. Obviously, we have to open up as well on how young people seeing things too. And then I would like to introduce about Malaysian Youth Council as well in this case. And Malaysian Youth Council, as known as MBM, Majlis Belia Malaysia, we have 41 affiliated members, and we are involved in policy making consultations through Malaysian Youth Consultative Council and also through memoranda. And we are also affiliated members of CAYC. CAYC have a close working relationship with ASEAN Secretariat as well. So the Committee for ASEAN Youth Cooperation has been established in 1981, and it enjoys working relationship with the ASEAN senior officials on youth. So when there are meetings among the senior officials in ASEAN member states, so CAYC will be invited as well. And I would say we have the privilege as well from MBM to be participated in a few meetings too. And then the sorts of development activities, the sorts of education activities that happens, it does not just restrict it within a classroom. So youth organizations in this case are very important because it provided the means or the ways for young people to be involved in leadership activities, volunteerism, exchanges even. And from those activities that they participated in, they are involved with learning activities as well. So we call it expansive activities where the learning expand rather than just limited in classroom. It expanded through the activities that they included in, they participated in. Yeah. And then the most importantly, I think, Jazreen, ASEAN already declares that this year is the year of ASEAN youth. So it is very important for both young people, young leaders, young activists, and also the government policymaker, the government officials to know that and to acknowledge that and to include that in their planning of programs, for example, for young people. So we can see that youth organization is a collective site for learning. Through my research, I found that there are 3 stages for young people involving in youth organizations. And then because my study is focusing on Malaysia only, so what we can see is the first stage is more like getting to know the organization because of interest, because they wanted to join, because of fun. And then the second stages is where they found that they are connected to the roles and to the objective of their organizations, which then lead to the third stages where they found that they wanted to have more responsibility and then guided the organization as well through their goals. Okay, I think I stop here now, and then I can discuss further on the transformative activists and how does it mean for education to be expanded in youth activities as well, and how it can help young people in ASEAN community at large. Okay,
all right, thank
Jasmine?
you so much, Dr. Shafika, for sharing your experience as and the work you do at MBM. It's interesting to note that the activities involving youth are becoming more often, and of course, considering this year is ASEAN Year for Youth, we should embark in more discussions like this. So moving on, we also need to note that youth play a pivotal role in shaping the ASEAN Economic Community pillars to support further economic development for the ASEAN region. As mentioned by Dr. Eric Thompson, he also shared an overview of the ASEAN Youth Development Index, which includes awareness on ASEAN values and identity. So, Dr. Eric, would you mind to share that how should we further promote ASEAN values among youth in hopes to contribute towards a further ASEAN economic integration? Over to you, Doctor.
Sure, thank you. I think to address your question, I'd like to link this back a little bit to some of the points that have been raised, the very important and good points in the discussion raised by our other panelists. One of the things to think about is the way it's very important, and this is, I think, exactly as Professor Ahmad was saying. It's very important to think about the ways in which ASEAN is, in a sense, presented to youth across the region, for them to think about what does it mean for Malaysia or every nation to be a member of ASEAN, and then as citizens of those nations, what does it then mean to also be a citizen of ASEAN? One of the issues, I think, especially is, and this is especially with the ASEAN Economic Community, right? What does this really mean for people? And as Professor Ahmad already said, he did a number of surveys, and many other people have done similar sorts of surveys around all of ASEAN, asking youth things like, for example, whether or not they're sort of prepared to compete in a more like an ASEAN open economic and a free trade area, for example, right? So that's an important question, but there is something to think about in like how we present ASEAN to people, even in the context of a survey like that, right? Because if you're asking the question like, are you sort of prepared to compete? It's already framing things as the opening up of ASEAN being something that's going to be, it's say you're going to have to compete, as if like, before we have ASEAN, before we have the AEC, you'll just get a job, there's no competition, it'll be quite easy. And now you're going to have to compete with other people. Now, there's some truth to that in a certain sense, depending on how the AEC is opened up, right? But then we can ask other questions like, do you think that you'll be able to, all indications are that the more that there's an ASEAN open economic zone, the more trade and commerce there is going on, among ASEAN countries, that will produce some kinds of profits and hopefully prosperity, right? So in what ways are people prepared to or think that they can share in the profits that are generated through an AEC, right? In what way do people thought about, or are they prepared, or can they imagine ways in which they can take advantage of the opportunities afforded by the AEC? One of these things might be, for example, like, again, I really want to go back and emphasize what Dr. Saifuddin said before about, I mean, this is something that AEC and ASEAN have to do, but to really make sure that it's not only a framework where large multinational corporations can, run around the region pushing down wages. That's not what you want. But you do want a framework where small and medium, the communist sort of attempt at like redistribution, that kind of didn't work, right? Everybody's sort of on board that we need some sort of framework for essentially, a capitalist system where people can have businesses and, develop those businesses. But what's really important is that you can't allow for sort of there to be monopolies or duopolies or, systems where only large mega corporations are the only game in town. And you have to have a framework where small and medium enterprises are able to operate. But then there are great opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises, small businesses, relatively speaking, small, right, to open up their markets to, to find more consumers, to find more people to sell to, right, in other ASEAN countries. So are the youth today sort of thinking about that? How are they being prepared to do that, to take advantages of the opportunities, right? And I think that's a really big issue. And I think the last thing I'll say about this is, and I'll say there's I think a cautionary tale from Thailand on this matter, because in the time that I've been sort of doing this research about ASEAN and so forth for more than 15 years now, right? And in that time, and there was a moment at which the AEC, was around 2014, I guess, roughly speaking. Maybe don't quote me on that, but around then, right when the AEC was about to be formally launched, of all the countries in ASEAN, Thailand was the one that really publicly took this most seriously. And there was just constant things. Every day you'd see in the Thai press, you'd see discussions about like the AEC and what it means for Thailand. And, one of the great initiatives was in every school in Thailand, in all of the villages, they call it Ban Nok there, but the kampong, every kampong in Thailand had, every school in every kampong had like all of the ASEAN flags flying, and they have ASEAN Resource Center to really teach students about it. But all of this discussion around the AEC really focused on competition and how much, we have to get ready for the competition. It's going to be competition, it's going to be competition, but that frames it in sort of a very negative way. And we found that the attitudes and awareness and the sort of orientation of Thai students actually it was we did a survey in 2007 and then another one in 2014. And the attitudes towards ASEAN actually turned much more negative, I think, because of that constant like framing things as a competition and the possible negative consequences of this, right? Without, I think, really emphasizing the possibilities and the opportunities that a more open ASEAN framework can provide. So again, going back to, just to reiterate what Professor Ahmad said, it's very important of how does this get framed and how do we sort of orient and convey the positive and important aspects of it, without being Pollyannish, without, we have to admit, as has been said by several panelists and Dr. Sri Saifuddin, right, that there are some serious issues about sort of maybe reforming the AEC and making sure that it is going to provide a sort of shared prosperity, not only for the already advantaged or already sort of well-positioned people within the region. Right? Okay, I'll pass it on to other panelists and come back for more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eric. It's interesting to see that Thailand is already far ahead in empowering students, especially through education and providing ASEAN-related studies or inputs to their students. So this relates back to what Dr. Nita said, that we should encourage more ASEAN studies or ASEAN related curricula, or introduce ASEAN studies in universities or in formal studies. So back to Dr. Niza, from the academic side, as you mentioned, that there are ways that we can further promote interest in ASEAN. So apart from providing or introducing ASEAN related studies, how should we further encourage interest among youth to do research on ASEAN, and how would this contribute to strengthening the ASEAN relations in general? Over to you, Dr. Niza.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. As I mentioned in the first part, the important you can say introduce the not only the course on ASEAN at the universities, but also universities need to take up the challenge of introducing ASEAN studies rather than focusing or continuing with the Southeast Asian studies. What I'm trying to say is not to replace, but to add something which is on ASEAN studies, because this is more contemporary and its impact on the transnational aspect. Yeah. Another way to answer your question is to encourage. I think Dr. Eric has already mentioned, yeah, about in Thailand they raised the ASEAN flag. Yeah, as you know, in all ASEAN member countries and their embassies overseas, they also raise the ASEAN flag, but not in you can say in the schools or universities. Yeah, the awareness of it. So what I'm trying to say here is that, for example, in the context of ASEAN Day celebration, the youth are not being encouraged to see themselves as being part of the ASEAN community. Yeah, so there is a need for the ASEAN Day celebration to be promoted every year, for example, in schools or the universities, if we really interested or focused on having the spirit of the ASEAN Economic Community or ASEAN community itself. I guess Dr. Shafiqa also mentioned about this year is the year of ASEAN Youth. Yeah, this should be promoted even more. I'm not quite sure whether in schools they also been mentioned about this. They know about it. They have the feelings of being the ASEAN community. That's what need to be installed and make them aware of it. For example, in universities, there should be more of the ASEAN clubs, for example. Yeah, established in universities. I know University of Malaya, they have UNESCO club. Yeah, and many universities were asked to establish or encouraged to establish UNESCO club. Why not ASEAN club? Yeah, to install the awareness and also the spirit of being ASEAN community. Another one is that it can be suggested that several programs be introduced and improved. For example, in the context of intra-ASEAN youth exchange, for example. Yeah. The educational trips, for example, visiting some towns or historical places, for example, Malacca, Ayutthaya in Thailand, Yogyakarta. This will, I believe, will strengthen the friendship, and to some extent is even inculcate the deep understanding among the youth about what it feels to be the ASEAN community itself. If you look, the Japanese government, they have the initiative, yeah, through what we call Southeast Asian Youth Program. Maybe you know, maybe some of the participants being already involved in this kind of activities. This program, through the use of a ship called Nippon Maru, yeah, sailing to all Southeast Asian countries, together with ASEAN students and Japanese students, and the idea to promote friendship and understanding, not only for the Japanese student, but Southeast Asian youth. So this is a good example for you can say, Southeast Asian countries, yeah, in this context, ASEAN, to really look at how to inculcate more of the feeling of being ASEAN and the interest on the ASEAN studies. I guess what is important is that this once we have this student involvement in all this suggested activity I mentioned to you, hopefully, yeah, there will be no feeling of negativity, or they will look more on the positive side of this ASEAN Economic Community. I think I will stop there, Jazrin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Niza. We believe that the activities or the initiatives that was outlined are good examples. And as Dr. Niza mentioned, we need more robust promotion activities. We need to establish more clubs. We need to encourage more participation so that our students are more open to explore ASEAN studies and contribute to the academic discourse. Now, we have Dr. Shafiqah. As an active youth activist, would you like to share your opinion on empowering youth, especially women development, through education, and your experience handling different roles in youth-related organizations? Dr. Shafiqah, over to you.
Thank you, Jazrin. But before that, I really like what Dr. Eric and Prof. Ahmad had mentioned just now. Like Dr. Eric mentioned that the problem on the narratives that we put for AEC itself was very limited, was very competitive in terms of that does not really relate to young people. So if we go out there and then ask random young people in street, or probably old as well, what does ASEAN means to you? They would say, well, it's an organization, and how does that relate to them in person? So I have the narratives that we have to highlight it and change that. It's more towards collaborative effort rather than just competitiveness of the country or an individual person or individual citizen of any ASEAN member states. So yeah, that's very important to highlight, that the narratives of ASEAN is for collaborations, for cooperatives, and for young people, and also the older generation as well, to acknowledge that there are more opportunities available, more collaborative networks available, and there are also expensive resources that we can share. And obviously the ideas will just sprout from one member state to another if we had really strong narratives of what AEC means. And then yeah, thank you for your question just now in asking on how and the ways that we could do on young people and in focusing for young women as well. So currently in MBM, we are in partnership with UNICEF Malaysia. We are focusing on consciousness raising on gender. And then we focus on empowering young women and girls as well. We're trying to talk more about young girls, and we want to explore the gender experience of girls and young women in youth association and also in other institutions as well. So for example, at school, how do they feel, and what kind of space that they need to talk about those things, or the only things that only probably related to young women or young girls. And we also wanted to encourage boys and also other genders to be included in those conversations as well. It's not just when we talk about girlhood or women empowerment, it's not just women that is limited to those discussions, but we need people like men and leaders, and yeah, to be included as well in the conversation, because we are talking about gender equality, and it's not just about superiority of one gender to another. So that is what we are trying to do through our program All About Girls with UNICEF. And among other programs that we work together with UNICEF Malaysia is also upskilling with Orang Asli community. So we encourage Orang Asli community to build their own, because they are in the community and they know what are the needs and what are the requirements and what are the culture there. So we encourage them to develop an entrepreneurship program for themselves, so that they can develop the economic prosperity of their community. So they are not just working for themselves, but they are working for the community of orang asli that they are in. So in that terms, I wanted to highlight that youth organizations or probably young people, they are energetic, they are full of energy, they are proactive, and they are able to identify the problems. And they are able as well to identify the solutions. It might not be big, but those are learning processes, and those are the education process that are included within the daily activities. So we wanted to encourage that as well in ASEAN, that education, learning can be in small and big ways as well. And then, and if we encourage that, we are able to foster probably relatable identities between one and another in ASEAN. So if, let's say, we acknowledge that there are certain different cultures, right, in every member states. And then we also identify that there are certain things that we share together, and highlighting those similarities, highlighting those, oh, okay, we share the same or similar culture. We take off shoes when entering house. So those are small things, but we can identify with each other because we understand the values behind that small actions, right? So even though it is a small discussion, I think it's important. Probably if you wanted to talk about that, we can talk it in primary school. So probably having a short session in primary school. Okay, what do you think that the daily tasks that we do in daily life, right, that you think other member states as well are doing too? So those are small things. Okay, what are the food, right? We connect strongly with food, obviously, as Malaysians and other ASEAN countries, right? So how about tap on that? So those are the resources. Those are our rich resources, actually, our culinary resources, right? So we can tap more on that. So I think I'll stop there too, Jasmine, and then we can continue the discussion further.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Shafiqa, for
Thank you.
sharing the youth perspective from the lens of a woman and on the ASEAN Economic Community. So thank you to each of the panelists for contributing to the discussion of youth perspective on the ASEAN Economic Community. What does it mean for local youth in ASEAN member states? Now, I would like to open the floor for questions. So feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will try to address the questions or concerns regarding the topic, youth perspective on the ASEAN Economic Community. What does it mean for local youth? Thank you for sharing your questions. We hope to see more questions coming in. All right, Dr. Eric has put a hands up. Would you like to say something, Doctor?
I thought I saw one of the questions in the Q&A related to sort of the teaching of sort of the history and teaching about ASEAN. It's also something that Dr. Ahmad said earlier. I'd like to follow up with that because I think it's an important point of I agree that the expansion of more teaching about especially ASEAN, more generally about sort of international relations, more teaching about sort of Southeast Asia and teaching about ASEAN, as was said, the promotion of sort of, for example, ASEAN studies courses and so forth. I think that's really important. But I think it's also, I would say, an approach that I would like to see developed more is sort of integrating sort of current understanding. I think that the focus on the current form of ASEAN and understanding how ASEAN works and what ASEAN is really important. But also linking that back to a much longer history of Southeast Asia as a region and the ways in which, if you look at any of the historical examples of very prosperous ASEAN or Southeast Asian societies, right? Let's take Malacca as an example, right? I mean, I think everybody in Malaysia I hope, knows a little bit about Malacca, knows that for, for 100 years, it was sort of the most prosperous place in Southeast Asia. Well, but do we understand why it was prosperous? Well, it was prosperous not because of the competition there, but because of the cooperation there, right? There's a wonderful book I would encourage everybody to look at by Leonard and Daya called Leaves of the Same Tree, which looks at the Malaccan Strait ports and how the relationships developed there. And specifically with Malacca, what he points out is, and it's true before Malacca, its predecessor, sort of what we call Sriwijaya, right? That there were these cooperative relationships between, for example, you had, in a very simple sense, you had the Melayu and the, who organized and sort of managed the port there, but it was prosperous because they were operating in relationship with, cooperating with the, what we now call like the Orang Asli, right? Who were bringing forest products in to the market there, and the Orang Lau, who were, sort of, I mean, in a very simplistic sense, sort of the navy or the sort of the maritime police for the Sultanate, right? And it wasn't because it wasn't. This is what's really important, though, is that those cooperative and then of course cooperating with then all of the people from all over the world, the Chinese, with Ma Huan and the treasure ships coming, and the Arab traders and traders from all over the world, right? And being able to cooperate, not by making everybody have the same identity or be the same, but cooperating across those specific different sort of cultures and societies that people had, right? That Orang Asli contributed something specific because of their own culture and knowledge of the inland areas of the peninsula. The Orang Laut contributed specifically because of their knowledge and their culture of the seas, right? Melayu had a long history of sort of managing these kinds of trade ports and so forth, and the contributions of Chinese and Arabs and many others, right? And so looking at that history, and especially the last thing I'll say, and this is what, I mean, I and many other people have been trying to, reorient, like thinking especially about ASEAN, as ASEAN is its very special sort of unique thing. And it's a way in which the people and the leaders of Southeast Asia have worked since kind of World War II and decolonialization, post-colonial period, right? In becoming new independent nations and then figuring out ways to cooperate within a region of Southeast Asia. And I'll say very unlike the EU, ASEAN is always, I think, very inappropriately thought of as like, or compared to the EU. The EU is a different thing. The EU is based on a sense of like a European sort of pan-national identity, right? Of being one sort of European people. But ASEAN, I would say, to use a simple term, ASEAN is not a sort of nation state writ large. ASEAN is a plural society writ large, right? Which is what people in Southeast Asia have been doing literally for thousands of years, is figuring out how to cooperate across and between sort of different societies and different cultures and different peoples, right? And to sort of, and I hope that, youth today will like take that forward and think of like, how can we do that in a modern world, right? And sort of make sort of prosperous cooperative relationships with people who are not like ourselves, right? But from whom we can share and develop. Okay. I'll just say, yeah, I'll leave it there and let other people.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eric, for answering the question. And it is great to know that we often neglect the conversation on indigenous people, both on land and on seas. And I would like to share that we at IDEAS acknowledge the challenges faced by the Orang Asli community. And we actually have done some work on Orang Asli, empowering them through education, which is available on our website, of course. So let's move on to the Q&A session. We actually have a question, the first question for YB Dato Sri Saifuddin, if you'd like to answer. The question is, your views on current work culture, employee mindset, and overall digital ecosystem are progressive and rare. Do you think that the Malaysian work environment can evolve at the pace of our ASEAN neighbors, for example, like Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand, so that the talent diaspora does not continue to leave Malaysia? Sorry. And if yes, by when do you think it can be done? Over to you, YB.
Oh, that's not an easy question. I think there are a couple of things. Number one, the movement of people working not necessarily in one particular country should be the norm rather than exception. That's what digital economy is all about. So to me, we should be, again, if I'm using the word openness, we should be open to the fact that Malaysians can work wherever they are. Well, first and foremost, it's their right. You can't stop people, even if they want to become a citizen of another country. Please don't misquote me on this one. But yeah, coming back to that point, we have to for digital economy, people just have to move. When I was in my last portfolio in charge of multimedia and communication, I bumped into two young Malaysian, one Hazmi and Daim, who were among the creators involved in the making of this game. What's that game? Fantasy. This old guy cannot remember even the name of the game. I mean, people who are in gaming, they know this, what fantasy. Anyway, they were in Japan. They were in Tokyo. The two of them now has, what?
Is it Final Fantasy?
Final Fantasy, sorry. They work in Japan for more than 10 years. Now Hazmi has come back to Malaysia, but Daim is still in Japan. Why Japan? Why Tokyo? Because Tokyo is the Silicon Valley of gaming. You have to be there. But they are still Malaysian, very patriotic. Now they have started an all-Malaysian company called Metronomics, and they have produced their first game that is all Malaysia. The Battle of Ben, using the background, using DK Barat as the genre. They call it, what's the name of the game? No Straight Road. All right. Now, yeah, Malaysia learned through experience that we need to be more, the government have to be more proactive, must be more understanding. We have lost two iconic products to other countries. Not that because of that we have to, I'm not going back to my word that we have to be open. All I'm saying is someone came out with this idea to produce again, how come my kepala is so rusty this morning? I can't even remember. Pen drive. But pen drive didn't get the support of the Malaysian institution. Pen drive went abroad. Grab didn't get the kind of attention and support from Malaysian authorities. So Grab went to Singapore. I'm not saying because of that, no, I'm makan balik apa yang saya cakap. No, all I'm trying to say is every ASEAN member state must be so open to new ideas. It doesn't matter who this young chap come with, whichever idea, you just have to support them. And I would like to see, my last point would be, we have Malaysia, we have MDEC, and I believe every ASEAN member state has got their own agency supporting digital economy, especially for the young. I would like to see these agencies working together more closely at the ASEAN level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, YB. As we can see that there are a lot of opportunities for youth out there across all ASEAN region, and youth, it's left for youth to explore those opportunities, which led us to the next question for Dr. Niza. How can youth, especially students, prepare for the current environment with high inflation, high interest rates, and also limited jobs? Over to you, Doctor.
All right, thank you very much. It's interesting question, how youth can be prepared, with this current situation. Now, I would like to put it this way. When we talk about youth nowadays, the importance of internet, for example, we can see that in the context of fast-growing internet users, 125,000 new users, come online every day. For example, in the year 2020, and in Malaysia, the growth of mobile use, and not only in Malaysia, in Southeast Asia, so the youth need to be prepared with this new technology, and because this is have the you can say open up opportunity for them, in the job market, for example. I know I talk about job market, so even it is open opportunity for youth if they are willing to. I'm sorry to use the word compete. I know that you don't like to use the word compete, but what I'm trying to say is that nevertheless, the world outside is not only cooperation but also competition. Okay, so the youth need to be prepared with it. Not only the youth, to some extent the government itself. If you look at ASEAN itself, the technology adoption, that differs greatly from within ASEAN member countries. So there is really a need that to build a regional internet infrastructure. That is my take on that. Now, with regard to the aspect of competition, not that I'm looking at from the competition perspective, but the reality of it. Dr. Sri already mentioned earlier in his welcoming speech that ASEAN countries, ASEAN countries intra-ASEAN trade, within ASEAN member countries, it's only 25 to 30%. Now we are talking about integrating it as a single market. Now we are not showing it at the moment. We are not showing it at the moment. It's 25 to 30% only. So the reality, what I'm trying to say here, is a challenge. I'm not saying this is something that a hindrance. No. This is a challenge. There is a lot of opportunity for greater ASEAN integration. Be it in economy, be it between youth that need to face this reality, the world reality. Of course, not only in terms of the youth need to be savvy in IT or things like that, but also in the context of new ideas that they can bring together for the benefit of all in the community. I think again the challenge also, as what Dr. Sri already mentioned, there are new ideas that are coming in, but countries are lack in you can say accepting it. There are many new inventions, for example, by the youth. Every year we have heard about expos here at this university, this institution. But where does it go? All this new finding, all this new innovation. It really go back to us. It really go back to the ASEAN government itself. Because most of these innovations, they go further. I mean, they go to the foreign land, foreign countries, especially in the West. So we, ASEAN government itself, need to look in this context. That new ideas from the youth, for example, need to be taken or not to be, you can say, take into consideration. To help them, you can say, improve further the society at large. I think that's about it, Desiree.
Thank you very much, Dr. Niza. Yes, we can see now that the challenges youth face can be a bit more intimidating, especially in this digital era. So this leads me to the next question for Dr. Shafiqah. What are your thoughts on improving the communication about ASEAN, especially with ASEAN Economic Community, as the discussions are often complex and intimidating for youth to comprehend? How can we make it more accessible and layman as possible? Dr. Shafiqah, over to you.
Thank you, Jazrin, and thank you, Elisa, for the great question. And I think it's important for us to itemize the discussion to really make the discussion really small and relatable for young people to talk about it. So I have two suggestions here. And then the first thing that we can do is probably to highlight the benefits of having AECs as well, a part of having the language to be more everyday like or local language, and even to use humor in the conversation as well is very important as well for us to make sure that the conversation is relatable, and rather than intimidating conversation, it can be more open for young people to receive it as well. So there are openness there. And then to make it accessible, probably is to use the platform which young people mostly use. It can be in gaming platform, it can be in Twitter platform, it can be in Discord. So a short, it shouldn't be long. It can be a 10 minutes short talk or discussions, or probably a quick chat about AEC. That would be enough. People don't need to spend their whole hour to talk about this, to understand snippets of what does it mean for them to be to have an ASEAN identity, for example, right? To know what is the benefits of ASEAN to them as an individual. So I suggest to use the platform that is being used by young people, such as to host the TikTok Live, Twitter Space, Instagram Live, Discord, and then start within the closest circle of the young people. They can start with family, asking questions to your parents. Mom, do you know something about this? Do you think that we should know it? I mean, that small conversation can lead to bigger conversations. So for example, one person can start, well, Googling, do you heard about this? What is so big about this? Right? They can start Googling it, and they can start finding information and finding more opportunities that they can do about it. Obviously, they are vast and expensive and expanding conversation that is going on about the opportunities for young people in AEC. But obviously, I would suggest to make sure that we use local language and also the everyday language, and to include a bit of humor as well in the conversation, just to make sure that it is relatable for people and relatable for young people as well. That is my suggestions. Thank you, Jazreen. And thank you, Elisa.
Thank you, Elisa, and thank you, Dr. Shafika, for answering the question. As we can see, we can always diversify our conversation via social media such as Twitter, TikTok, and it is also through this social media that we get to learn the problems faced by other youth, for example, in Myanmar, which also led us to our next question for Dr. Thompson. Given the current political and economic crisis in Myanmar, how can other ASEAN member states provide Myanmar with support? As a young person, it is disheartening to see how the non-interference policy has impacted ASEAN member states to address human rights violations in other ASEAN member states. The February 2021 coup in Myanmar is a primary example of this. Do you see this principle changing in the near future? Dr. Eric, over to you.
Thank you. That's a really good question. It's a really good question. It's also a very difficult question, right? I think where to begin. I guess one of the things to say is that, of course, I mean, whenever we see the things like things going on in Myanmar over the last couple of years, or other examples in other ASEAN countries in other times, right? It's always very disheartening to see social unrest and these these problems, right? But I think it's also important to sort of, I think it's, let me say that I think it's very appropriate to sort of push ASEAN or push other governments and push, whoever leaders, political leaders and so forth to, do their best to, ensure that human rights are respected and that people are, free and able to prosper and so forth. At the same time, I would say that it's important to also understand that the value of non-interference has a very deep and important meaning to ASEAN, right? That can't be easily overlooked. I mean, ASEAN's a region that for, you can say for several hundred years, but certainly for 100 years during the period of high colonialism, right, is governed by outsiders, by foreign powers, right? And people, generations fought very hard for independence from foreign interference, right? So it's a very important value to, I mean, one of the sort of common values across the region is the real importance of sort of national self-determination, right? And that's an important part of ASEAN. Part of sort of the framework of ASEAN is trying to have a framework where countries can both cooperate, but also can each, have their own autonomy and independence. And that's a very different sort of framework from the EU. The EU was born, in the wake of World War II and so forth, where nationalism meant, countries fighting each other. Whereas nationalism in Southeast Asia has always meant, countries becoming independent and free from colonialism. So that's so I think that on the one hand, I think that certainly it's appropriate to push ASEAN and push leaders, whether it's in other nations within Myanmar itself, to like sort of respect human rights and so forth, but also to understand that ASEAN does play a particular role in engaging with Myanmar in certain ways, right? In a sort of positive, constructive engagement. And hopefully you can have, there's other countries which maybe, well, I'm very much been in Singapore for a very long time now, but originally you might tell from my accent, I grew up in the United States, right? There's countries like the United States when they're at their best, the United States is not always at its best, but when it's at its best, it can promote human rights and push things and have sanctions and stuff. That's kind of a different sort of engagement. So different organizations or the United Nations can engage in certain ways. So ASEAN has a particular way of engaging. I think it's very useful to understand the productivity of that engagement, because it may not, push human rights in the ways that one might want it to, in your heart or whatever, but it does have a sort of productive role to play to get a government like the current one in Myanmar to engage and hopefully productively have productive, constructive opportunities, right? That's what I'll say. I mean, it's maybe not a completely satisfying answer, but it's at least a thing to reflect on.
All right, thank you, Dr. Eric, for sharing your thoughts on that. And so the next question is open to everyone in the panelists. So the question is, as a Malaysian youth, I don't think of myself as an ASEAN citizen. I have self-identified more with the Southeast Asian region, as I am an international student in America. This identity arose from in-person interaction with other international students from Southeast Asian region. So how can we encourage transnational relations for youth beyond state-sponsored programs? Anyone would like to take the question?
This is not really an answer, but it's someone mentioned about the Nippon Maru. The Nippon Maru, the Ship for Southeast Asia and Japanese Youth Program, started in 1974. Now it's Nippon Maru Ship C, the third ship, and it's still going strong. The problem is we have the ASEAN Youth Ministers Meeting, but we have never created anything that is made in ASEAN for ASEAN youth. That is the problem. MDM has been shouting about this since time immemorial. Why can't ASEAN youth ministers just get something done? And so the best ASEAN program for the youth that has been going for as long as since 1974 is made in Japan, unfortunately.
All right, thank you, YB. Anyone else would like to answer the question?
Maybe just a little bit of view. It's because ASEAN, the economic community, been introduced, basically in 2015. It's a new thing, even though ASEAN was in existence since 1967. Again, there are many, you can say, we can understand that the youth are still not have that feeling of being ASEAN community itself. It takes years, it takes decades for European Union also, yeah, to have that kind of feeling of being the EU community. Yeah. So ASEAN itself just started 2015, yeah, of trying to inculcate further of being as an integrated organization, yeah, having single market or economy, yeah. So nevertheless, I think as what I have been mentioned earlier, the ideas of the education system need to inculcate more on this. Yeah, the feeling of ASEAN itself. Yeah, having the ASEAN days, having you can say curriculums at school, emphasizing or at least introduce something on ASEAN, a contemporary ASEAN. Yeah, not something like historical kind of A to Z. Yeah, that doesn't interest students nowadays. Yeah, students want something contemporary, the issues of human rights, the issue of democracy, what they can do and what they cannot do, things like that. Yeah, that will, of course, we can see that the ASEAN students. I remember university student, for example, yeah, before the pandemic, when we have this, everybody can fly through Asia. Many students, tend to do a vacation overseas or visiting even some universities. University Malaysia Sarawak, for example, in my department, yeah, we take students every year to overseas as part of the activities, yeah, before they leave or graduate. Yeah, so we could bring them to Cambodia, have you can say collaboration with the universities, visiting places, historical places, doing some community works. Yeah, that can inculcate the understanding, further understanding on ASEAN itself. Yeah, we take them to Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, even up to China also. Yeah, so that's one way of inculcating better understanding or better, you can say the ideas of what ASEAN community is supposed to be. Okay, that's my take on this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Niza. I think what we can get from that is that it's not just state-sponsored program, but also universities' own initiative to send their students or to make programs outside of their own member states, and to highlight what YB has mentioned, that there are activities also outside of member states that involve countries like Japan, which could possibly pose a language barrier. And this leads to our next question for Dr. Shafiqa. With the language barrier between ASEAN member states, how can youth effectively integrate and collaborate? Because I have joined multiple programs involving student leaders in ASEAN, but many representatives from CLMV countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, are those from privileged backgrounds, as they are proficient in English. We rarely get to engage with students from rural or marginalized backgrounds, and this is an issue because their issues and concerns are not represented. Sorry, Dr. Shafiqa, over to you.
Thank you for the question. And this question is actually highlighted two issues, right? The first one is about representation, and then the second one is about the language barrier. And thank you for such an interesting questions. And then let me just try to share my opinion on this. And then I do agree that this happens a lot, and we do not able to reach out to the undeserved or the issues or the concerns of the young people who are not represented in lots of state-sponsored programs, for examples, right? But what we can do is, of course, in MBM and also as a member of CAYC, is we would like you to work together with us, to collaborate together for us to go into these places. So probably if we cannot we cannot really understand the issues of the locals within that countries. What we can do is ask the helps for this participant or representative from the privileged backgrounds to help us translate it, probably promo materials, and to help us communicate what are the things or what are the issues that we wanted to focus on. And I have 3 suggestions on this. First is to identify the needs of the local youth themselves. And then to do that, we need to be there with the borders opening up now. We need to be there and then really engage with the people there. Even though there is a language barrier, we can always have the help of the translator, one. And then the second thing, when the presence is another communication. We being there in presence and really understanding and trying to listen to the people from the local areas really makes a difference. Even our presence can communicate a lot there. We are being there because we wanted to know more what are the issues there, and we wanted to help and ways to collaborate as well. So those are one thing that we can do, is to be there in person. And then the second, to identify the local needs, of course. And then we can include the translator in that sense. And of course, young people, I guess, even the university students, those who are in the privileged backgrounds that you mentioned just now, are also opening up themselves to be to volunteer for translating as well. So we can collaborate together with them on that part. And then we can start learning everyday language from ASEAN countries as well. I guess that is important. Sometimes we're focusing too much on English as English only, but we can start learning the everyday language of the other ASEAN countries. It can start with the daily greetings. It can start with how to buy water. It can start with simple conversations, just like simple conversation in ASEAN language. And we can even create a toolkit from that and then distribute it to other member states, young people across ASEAN, right? And then to underline all these 3 suggestions is to ensure that we are there in any ways to listen. And then that's the thing about integrate and collaborating. We have to emphasize the elements of trust there. We have to opening up ourselves to trust other people, and we have to ensure and put more effort to make sure that others in other ASEAN countries trust us as well. So I can put that is a very layman language on how to build relationships between, or to collaborate at first, right? But those are important. It can be in simple manner, but that is important. So that's how we can engage and collaborate with others as well. And of course, in MBM and in CAYC as well, we are opening up to collaborate. So come and meet us, and we can discuss further potential to collaborate as well, to go into these rural and underserved areas across ASEAN too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shafiqah. That marks the end of our Q&A session. My apologies if due to time constraint, we are unable to answer all questions, but we appreciate all the questions that you have shared with us. So I would like to pass the floor to each of the panelists to give their final remarks about 1 minute to the audience out there. So we can start with Dr. Eric. Would you like to give your final comments on the topic on youth perspective on the ASEAN Economic Community?
Sure. I mean, there's so many things one can say. I'll just say this, that I think something I mentioned before is about, learning more of both about ASEAN, what ASEAN itself is, right? Not as like some version of the EU or something, but ASEAN itself, the history of ASEAN, why it developed the way it did. And even the broader history, someone said in one of the questions about, being, having identity with ASEAN versus, thinking about being Southeast Asian. And clearly one of the things ASEAN as an organization is trying to do is to become more of a fuller representative of the region, not just for diplomats, but for Southeast Asians to see themselves as represented in ASEAN. And I'll say finally, in terms of the ASEAN Economic Community, to really learn more and to imagine both what Southeast Asia has been and can be, and even is today, right? I mean, Malaysia is quite a prosperous country. Singapore, I have to say, it's a bit insane here. Singapore is the third wealthiest country in the world, right? This is not a poor region. This is a region which was known as Suvarnabhumi and Suvarnadipa, the lands of gold, the islands of gold during the Sanskrit cosmopolis, right? It's a region that has at many times, and Malacca being an example, has at many times in history been seen as one of the wealthiest regions in the world, right? It's only like sort of in the 20th century, there's this like unusual period of poverty, right? But there's a lot of potential here, and hopefully, by learning about it and conceptualizing and imagining what ASEAN is and can be, I think this is, again, to emphasize the opportunities, right? And not, yes, there's competition for sure, but there's also opportunities for cooperation and prosperity. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Eric. Next, can we have Dr. Niza to share your final comments or thoughts on youth perspective on the ASEAN Economic Community?
All right, thank you. I think with regard to these ASEAN economic communities, in promoting it, it's a collective responsibility. Not only from the government, from the universities, the youth itself. It's a collective thing. By and large, youth is the future leaders. So if we don't consider youth, if we don't take interest in youth, the so-called top-down approach, will not work, because it doesn't involve the whole thing. It must be bottom-up approach in a way that in order for the ASEAN Economic Community to be realized. And I believe the youth are the key to it. It's not just come a decision from the top. It must be also the things must be initiated at the grassroots. And youth is the important component of the society that will ensure the success of this ASEAN Economic Community. And again, the spirit or the collective ASEAN community spirit must be installed, among the youth in order for it to achieve the goal set by the government or by the policymakers in this context. I think there is a future for ASEAN Economic Community. If we look, of course, there are diversity, but there are also ways for us to cooperate, for us to feel the similarity that we have, as Southeast Asian or as ASEAN community. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Niza. Next, can we have Dr. Shafiqah to share your final thoughts on the youth perspective on the ASEAN Economic Community? What does it mean for local youth in ASEAN member states? Dr. Shafiqah.
Thank you. So my final take is to highlight the word collaboration there. I agree with what Prof mentioned just now about collective effort. It is a collective effort. And of course, to encourage for collaboration among young people in ASEAN, which it means to allow innovation, allow more creative approach, allow more knowledge building across ASEAN member states. And to do that, of course, not just on the young people, but also ASEAN leaders and senior officials to also advocate to lowering the entry barrier for these ideas to flourish. So these ideas need to flourish, and then lowering entry barrier could mean to ease the process, to moderate the process of dialogues, for example, and to provide platform. It can be just a simple platform like an online platform. It can be a webinar like ideas, and congratulations ideas for organizing this webinar. This is a platform for young people to voice out their concerns. I can see some questions that we are not able to respond just now, and I really hope to extend the discussion further. If anyone would like to discuss further, feel free to contact me via Twitter or email. And then, yeah, we would love to explore the potential collaborations as well. Just like I said, it's important to have collaborations in between any agencies, any sectors, and any businesses among young people, or if big or small, any small effort can make change. So that is my final take for today's session, Jasreen.
Thank you, Dr. Shafika, for acknowledging our efforts, which could not have been possible if not for the panelists we have here, and also YB, and also to our partner FNF in Bangkok. So finally, can we have YB Dato Sri Saifuddin to give your final comments or thoughts on the topic? YB, the floor is yours.
Now, I don't know that I get into this kind of trouble. I mean, if I can just pick up one point from Dr. Shafika, we really have to work on getting the young people together in the language that they understand, that is palatable to them. As we were discussing, I have with me now 3 fellow Perdana pupils, and I have given them a homework to check with Dr. Shafika. We can connect you guys later with MDEC. We have to work on something and I'm told that maybe among the tourism ministers in ASEAN, they have worked on something, but to get it off the ground is another story. And this is another issue. This is another way. This is another thing about the way ASEAN work. You can get all the 10 countries to agree on something, but to get it rolled out, you need, unfortunately, 2 or 3 countries to start. Then the others will follow. So the 2 or 3 countries that will start will have to bond the budget lah. Otherwise, nothing moves. This is unfortunately still the way ASEAN works. So we have to bear in mind, if that is the thing, then we have to navigate, start with something, 1 or 2 countries, then the rest will follow. I mean, for now, at least we can start with it. So what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to get something workable out of this discussion, and I thought with my humble way of doing it is probably since this is about youth, and this year is the ASEAN Youth Year, and being a former activist myself, then my contribution would be to try and do something about one of the points that was raised. Thank you.
And support towards the youth in ASEAN, especially on the topic on youth perspective on the ASEAN Economic Community. What does it mean for local youth in ASEAN member states? Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, today's event has come to an end. On behalf of IDEAS, we would like to express our sincere appreciation to our distinguished speakers, participants, and our partner, Frederick Naumann Foundation, FNF, who joined us for today's webinar on youth perspective on the AEC. What does it mean for local youth in ASEAN member states? We would also like to extend our appreciation to our viewers from all across ASEAN member states, from Japan, Myanmar, and also Singapore, and also those in the other government agencies in Sarawak. I hope that the audience has a better understanding of the roles of youth in shaping the future of the ASEAN Economic Community. Thank you very much, and we look forward to meeting you in the future event.